Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming out this evening for this much anticipated talk. My name is Margaret Hedstrom. I'm the interim director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. And I would like to thank our co-sponsors, the Office of the Vice President for Student Life, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and my home school, the School of Information, for their financial support and assistance with getting the word out. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Dr. David Pilgrim. Dr. Pilgrim is the founder and curator of the Jim Crow Museum, a collection of 11,000 racist artifacts located at Ferris State University, where he is also the chief officer for diversity and inclusion. The museum's mission is to use objects of intolerance to teach tolerance and promote social justice. Dr. Pilgrim is an applied sociologist with a doctorate from The Ohio State University and a leading expert on issues relating to multiculturalism, diversity, and race relations. The Jim Crow Museum grew out of his personal collection of more than 3,000 segregation-related artifacts, which he used as a professor of sociology at Ferris State in his race relations course. Professor Pilgrim made his collection publicly accessible by donating it to Ferris State University and launching the Jim Crow Museum in 1996. The museum opened its $1.3 million permanent exhibition in 2012 and is recognized nationally and internationally as a resource for students, teachers, researchers, scholars, human rights workers, the national media, and anyone seeking a deeper understanding of race relations. The museum enables visitors to understand that we learn racism through common, ordinary objects that both shape and reflect attitudes about race and racism, from the Jim Crow era up to the present day. Its objects are evidence of the social injustice that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. referred to as a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be exposed to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion. Such exposure is what the museum provides, and it provokes meaningful and painful dialogue that is necessary for understanding and confronting racial problems and moving past them. An exposure that is vitally important in our society at this moment. Dr. Pilgrim's work has received national and international attention. He has been interviewed by NPR, Time Magazine, the BBC, and dozens of newspapers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, the Chicago Tribune, and the Los Angeles Times. He has produced an award-winning documentary about the museum, and his writings, scholarly and creative, deal with multiculturalism and race relations. His short stories have been published in Kalalu, Obsidian, African American Review, AIM, and Shooting Star. His most recent book, published last year, is entitled Watermelons, Nooses, and Straight Razors, Stories from the Jim Crow Museum. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pilgrim.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Is this on? Is it? Oh, there we go. Very good. And you're going to show me how to do that little modern technology thing that makes the slides move. So if you had something to do with me being here today, would you raise your hand? Anybody? All right, everyone else look at them. Keep your hands up. If this goes well, those are the folks that you can thank. If it goes poorly, you can thank me, all right? So, yeah, there we go. Thank you so much. I'm not going to make my usual Ohio State, Michigan things, especially after Saturday. That was brutal. But I am tempted to tell some stuff, but I won't do it, so I'm going to make sure. Anyway, I want to start with, she did a little bit of this, but this is an excerpt from letter from Birmingham jail. And I don't know what you know about public letters. I travel the country and I tell people that letter from Birmingham jail is the most important, the most powerful public letter written by an American. And then it dawned on me, I don't know any other public letters. But this one right here, especially this particular quote, I'll summarize it this way, and I'll tell you why we use it. If you really want to deal with racism, really, really want to deal with it, then you have to look at it directly. And you have to treat it like a boil and lance it and let all the ugly pus come out. Isn't that such an ugly metaphor? Okay. Or maybe when you're in a jail, that's the kind of metaphor you come up with, right? So sometimes people say to me, why is it that you created a museum which has such horrible things in it? Well, we're taking a similar approach. And our approach is to document, not to serve as a shrine to racism, but to document the existence through material objects of attitudes, tastes, and values that permeated our culture. That's all, okay? Make sure this is working. It is not. What do I have to point at? Oh, there we go. So I want to give you a little bit of a disclaimer. I did clean this up a bit. I took out some images, but I left some in that there are people that might find offensive. I don't include things to titillate people or to engage in, just trying to be provocative. I show pieces that I need you to see in order for you to understand the things that I'm saying. I recently was walking through the museum. Keep in mind, we have a lynching tree in the museum. We have every conceivable expression of anti-black hatred that you could show in 2- and 3-dimensional objects. And it hit me like an epiphany that what that museum really is a museum of resiliency, both for the United States as a whole, but also for African Americans. Because if you look at, I'm going to tell you some things today that you have not seen in books. At least I haven't seen them in books. And some of those things are unpleasant. But if you understand the gap that existed in this nation between the races, then you'd have a better appreciation for where we are and where we hope to be. So when I was 12 years old, I bought my first piece. I was born in Harlem, but my folks had some family drama. That's none of your business. You don't need to ask me about that. You don't need to be interested in it. This is a tough crowd. When I joke from now, I'm going to do this with my hand, all right? That way you know I'm joking. Do they laugh at the University of Michigan? Just at Ohio State? Come on, can I tell one of my Michigan things? Yeah. All right, so I'm in art van. All right? And I'm glad you laughed at that, because then you're really going to get a kick out of what I say. And I had my Ferris shirt on. And you know how sometimes they engage in bait and switch? And so they advertise something in the paper, you go there, but they just happen to have sold the last one, right? And it was a sofa, and we wanted a sofa. My wife is here, by the way, hiding. And so they had this sofa for sale. And I get there, and I'm disappointed that they don't have anymore. But the person who's informing me that they don't have anymore looks familiar. And you know how you just have someone's face, and you think, I know this person. So for many years, I played amateur baseball, even as an old man, played in Grand Rapids. And anybody heard of Grand Rapids? Okay, very good. So I said to him, is it that I know you from baseball? He says, no, I never played baseball. I says, oh, I used to sell baseball cards and football cards and sports memorabilia. I said, did you collect sports stuff? He says, no. And I said, oh, I know what it is. You went to Ferris. And he said, oh, no. I went to a real school. I went to the University of Michigan. And I said, then that explains why your ass is selling sofas in Art Van. So, see, you like that? Okay, good. At Ohio State, that actually got a standing ovation. But I mean, at least, I thought, if I tell that, he'll be like Daniel in the lion's den, right? So anyway, when I was 12, I was growing up in Mobile. I was born in Harlem, but growing up in Mobile. And they had this sort of combination. It's like a hybrid flea market, carnival. I don't know. It's just a weird thing. So you had rides and cotton candy and stuff, but you also had flea market, a little bit like Burley Park or some of these things around Michigan. And so I bought it and I broke it. And I wish I had a better story. I wish it had been something philosophical or ideological. I wish a lot of things. The reality is I just didn't like it. And so I broke it. And I didn't break the second piece or the third or the fourth or the fifth or the sixth. The pieces we break now, I shouldn't say this because anybody here museum studies or whatever? We actually have like a MASH unit. And because people send us stuff now, we're getting stuff constantly from people, and sometimes it's broken when they send it. So we have like a little MASH unit. My point is, if something breaks now, it's an accident. But I broke that first piece. I don't break them now. In around the early 1990s, and this is when I met Brad. Does everyone know Brad Taylor, by the way? Brad Taylor has been one of the biggest supporters of the Jim Crow Museum. Back when we were there, a little bit after that. We had actually had shelves by the time you came. But this would have been like in the early 90s. I just had to get the stuff out of my home. My daughter, I remember one of them I had 2 Klan outfits, and I had them on mannequins. And she called them Daddy's dolls. And so, I had to get that out of my home. And so eventually, I tried to get them to a couple historical black colleges. That's a long story. Anyway, long story short, I donated it to Ferris State with some conditions that they would be preserved, they would be treated with respect, they'd be displayed, they'd be treated well even when I'm dead. So I had like this little agreement, right? It took many years, and eventually we ended up in this small room, and this is when Brad first brought a group down. And if you notice, it's a small room. It's only 500 square feet. It's smaller than this space. But I don't know if you can tell because pictures lie often, but doesn't it look like learning is going on? I mean, they're really engaging with these pieces. And even before we knew what visual thinking strategies were, we were doing it. We were asking people, when you look at this, what is it you see? What makes you say that? What else do you see? What makes you say that? And they're learning. So it was working. It took another basically 15 years to raise the money to build the facility that we're in now. And I talked to liberals, and I talked to conservatives, and I talked to blacks, I talked to whites, I talked to them in the middle, I talked to yellows, I talked to anybody. Trust me, I asked people for money. And they were like, no. No, and I'll tell you something I don't think I've ever said before, and I don't know if you guys are videotaping this. We're going to do some editing over various parts. Dave and I have an understanding. The reason we got built is because DTE, the energy people, right? The president of their foundation came up one day, and by that point, I had been turned down by so many people. I mean, celebrities, everybody said no to me. No, we're not. Because imagine, I was trying to explain what was in my head, and it sounded like this bad place, right? Okay. And so people kept telling me no. So anyway, the president of DTE granted me a meeting, and I said to him, listen, I don't want to waste your time. So I'm going to tell you all the reasons you're not going to give me money. Number one, you turn black people's electricity off all the time. He was like, what are you talking about? It's like, well, don't you have black customers? I go to Detroit, you're sitting right there. You're like a fortress right in Detroit, right? I said, so there's already bad feelings in some parts of the community about it. He says, yeah. I says, well, you have a newspaper there that historically has criticized some of the decisions you've made. This would make you vulnerable to even more criticism. He was like, yep. I said, and then you run the risk among your rivals of them using this and saying that you yourselves are racist. He says, yes. And then he said to me, this is the worst sales pitch. I didn't even have to do it that time. This is the worst sales pitch I've ever gotten. And I said, yeah, those are the reasons why it would be difficult for you to make the decision to do it. Let me give you one reason why you should. Because I believe and know to be true that you can use objects to get people to engage in meaningful conversations about race, and I'm not just talking shit. I mean it's for real. I need you to trust me. And he was like, okay. But we had a problem. The problem was they had African Americans, well, they had problems, primarily, though not exclusively, African Americans who work in leadership there who thought it was a bad idea. And I said to him, please give me an opportunity to meet with them. Don't speak for me. Don't try to explain what I'm trying to do. Put me in a room with them. It took 6 months to get that meeting scheduled. And when I walked in, I picked out one of the most heinous pieces that we had. And I also picked out one of the ink pens that President Lyndon Baines Johnson used to sign the 1964 Civil Rights Act into law. And I said, the museum is about both of these things because they both allow us to tell the story of Jim Crow. They gave us $250,000 and we were off and running, okay? Don't try that as a strategy. In 2012, the week that we were to open, I was on 131. It was one of those Michigan days. I'm an Alabama boy by way of Harlem. And you know how sometimes the sun is shining, you're actually kind of hot, but the road has ice on it? And I was going up 131. I live in Rockford, Grand Rapids area, driving north. You guys know what I'm talking about. Driving north to Big Rapids. And I see from a distance 5 cars, 2 of them upside down, one's a semi. And my first thought was, people in Michigan don't know how to drive. I'm serious. I thought that. And I've been living here for 30 years, and I'm still thinking that, right? And then I hit what they hit. Because I didn't know that there was ice on the road, I had my car in what they call cruise control. And it was a Buick Lucerne. It hit the ice, you know, the whole, what they call the hydroplaning thing. The car made a direct beeline to a tree, slammed into the tree at 80 miles an hour, okay? And it's one of those deals where, like, 2 weeks later, you read the probability of surviving, that kind of thing, and then you get scared, whatever. And just before I hit that tree, I had 2 thoughts, you know, like the devil and the cartoon thing with the good and the bad thing. On this, I thought, I'll be damned, I'm gonna die on 131. I actually thought that. And my other thought was, please, Lord, forgive me for my sins. And then I closed my eyes because I thought I'm gonna die, I don't have to watch it. I hit the tree, I was unconscious. One of the other people did die out there, but I didn't. And so what that has done for me, and I don't mean to be melodramatic, but what it has done for me is to make me appreciate that we all should have a bucket list. And on my bucket list, I wanted to make sure that museum was built. And I realized for much of the 90s, including into the 2000s, my greatest fear was that I was gonna die before that museum was built. And here it was 1 week away from opening. And I'm slamming into a tree at 80 miles an hour, all right? So now I'm in a hurry to do a lot of things, to write books, to build other things, well, I'll get to some of that. So that's me crying in 2012 when we opened. In the last few years, we've had people come from all over the world there. How many of you know Henry Louis Gates? Anybody? One of the funniest people I have met in my life. I'm gonna do a little name dropping just because you do that when you're insecure about your own accomplishments, okay? And so anyway, he's been a good friend. Henry Rollins came and shot an episode there. But we're not really for them. I mean, it's cool to have Skip Gates, Professor Gates come there, but it's cooler to just have folks come. A couple quick points. We receive hundreds of objects. We have now, Brad, you won't believe this, we have now reached a point where we are considering not receiving some pieces. How's it going? You look familiar. I know. Good to see you. You left Ferris this way you came, huh? All right. Yep. Good to see you. When you left, we were worse, and they got better. Does that help? Okay. All right. Good. So we now look at from my standpoint. I spent my teens, my 20s, my 30s, my 40s, my 50s stopping in every flea market, going in people's homes, putting myself in all kind of dangerous situations, spending money I did not have. And the pieces that I donated to the school, that was not a sample of what I saw. That was a sample of what I could afford. I mean, this was my whole life. I was an obsessive collector, right? And I have a friend who collects Pez dispensers. 1,000 of anything looks impressive. Does that make sense? It's an impressive collection. He loves his collection. I had a more nuanced relationship to you understand? I mean, I liked it and I didn't like it. But now, after all the years of not having money, now we're like, oh, we're having to consider not accepting something. Look at that look on my face. What is that? So here's a lesson. Here's a couple lessons. Some of you will be teachers. I talked to a few people in the audience. Here's one of the biggest lessons I learned as a teacher. I was a distinguished teacher at Ferris for years. Sometimes, when you're an instructor, there is this temptation to punish your students' ignorance in some cathartic way. And so a student says something that's ill-informed, not well thought out, sounds like prejudice to. By the way, you're not understanding what I'm saying? Yeah, that happens with some instructors. But here's the thing I learned. If you crush a person, you can't teach them after that. And not only can you not teach them, you can't teach anyone who witnessed it. And so if someone comes in the museum and says, it's good you Negroes came here instead of being in the trees of Africa, I probably know more about race than they do, because that's all I do is study it. Despite the fact that I'm stumbling around today because I'm not in my best, I could probably use the language better than they can. I can probably argue better than they can. I've probably had the argument. In other words, I could crush them. Don't do it. When you crush a person, you can't teach them. And discussions about racism, sexism, homophobia, these are the areas where we crush people. When Ben Shapiro came to Ferris, I'm the vice president of diversity and inclusion at Ferris. I don't have a problem with Ben Shapiro coming there. We're not going to spend $600,000 to keep him out of there or have to come up with that much insecurity the way some of the California schools do, because I want people to hear what he has to say. But what I've watched him do is crush 18-year-olds. Where's the sport in that? Indeed, where's the sport in crushing anyone? That's not what higher ed is supposed to be. So I always think, and this is the first time I've ever shown this slide in front of a group of people. When I think of everyday objects, which is what the museum is primarily, I usually think of not even two-dimensional, three-dimensional objects, ashtrays, toys, that kind of thing. But newspaper articles would be also. Now, how many of you know what flash fiction is? Everybody? Okay. So, like really short, like incidents, short stories. This reads like one. James Sanders, 25, was what white folks in the Deep South refer to contemptuously as an educated nigger. Instead of chopping cotton, he liked to sit in the shade of a willow tree on the creek bank and scribble diatribes. But Sanders' 3 R's proved his undoing. He wrote a letter to a young Hines County white girl. The girl's family said the letter was indecent and insulting. A posse shot Sanders dead. We could spend an entire day just on the way it was delivered. The fact that it was presented in a matter-of-fact way, without condemnation. They shot him dead. They shot him dead. One of the things we have started to do in the museum is to just collect newspaper articles. Newspaper articles. And here's, for those of you that do research in history, you undoubtedly know this, but I'll tell you anyway. My research changed significantly with things like newspapers.com came out. Everybody know newspapers.com? Actually, there's like 10 of those. That's probably the most reasonably priced. It's like $140 a year. So I can sit in my bed and do it every night and do what I used to do, used to travel to go to some major library to sit in a microfilm room and do this for 3.5 hours looking up 12 things that at the end of the day only one was useful. Now I can search literally thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of pages as quickly as Google. And it has changed everything. This is the kind of object we use in the museum. And typically, if you come in there, you wouldn't be hearing me doing this much talking, or one of our docents, because if they're doing this much talking, they're not doing it right. If you're in the museum, what they're doing is asking you, what is it you see? By the way, what is it you see? I know you're out there. I'm looking at you. What is it you see? Don't censor yourself. Just tell me what you see.
Black kid is food.
Okay, black kid is food, right? Black people are not the highest on the food chain, right? What else? What else?
Black person in pain.
Black person in pain. What else? Anyone? A postcard, maybe from the South. Maybe not. We have a section in the museum where we have a bunch of postcards. We only put ones in there from Michigan. And why do you think we did that? Because people assumed that racism was only from Biloxi, Mississippi, or Pensacola, Florida, or Mobile, Alabama, okay? So this is where I don't want us to get as a culture. I don't want us to get to a point as a culture where we can't look at an object and tell us what you see because of fear that I'm going to say the wrong thing. Okay? That doesn't help us as a culture. That hurts us as a culture. Are you still hearing me? Okay. So what is it you see? That's what you see. Okay, of what? Okay, and the man. Isn't there a representation of the man? How's he being represented? Yeah. Now, this is a kitchen in the museum. It's a little over the top, right? Most people wouldn't have had this much stuff. And this is one of the things I love about breakfast objects and kitchen objects. If there's a piece that has a racial slur, most of us know, that's probably wrong. If it's heavily caricatured, most of us know, that's probably wrong. But if it's an Aunt Jemima piece, see, the one person looking at Aunt Jemima, they see the vestiges of slavery and segregation. Someone else looking at Aunt Jemima, they see or think of, and I don't mean this flippantly, nostalgic memories of time spent with their family. The stable genius of the museum is that we put those two groups together. When you stop believing in the triumph of dialogue, leave higher ed. Just leave it. When the concept triumph of dialogue becomes mawkish and trite, leave higher ed. That's the typical experience in the museum, is because we built it so that a person could go through it themselves if they wanted to. Not everybody wants to hear a docent talking. I go to museums. I try to learn all the time. I went to one in Montreal. It was brilliant. I learned a ton. That guy would not shut up. I'm serious. It was brilliant. I could have read that stuff, though. It was freaking brilliant. He knew everything. What could he have not known? But he had a script. He had learned and mastered that script. And so you just walk from one section and he mentally, actually in a sense he was just reading it, he had already read it and committed it to memory. But we want people to experience the museum the way they experience it. In some cases that's in a tour. In many cases it's a person going through by themselves. I have learned so much about blackface. Here's one of those things I'm going to tell you that you don't find written in books. Like, who does this guy think he is coming here telling us what we don't find written in books, Brad? That is the most arrogant crap. That's from the Ferris State University. I'm trying to get that. It's not catching on. All right. I'll give you one of these things. I knew, and you know, that there was a period in America's history where people dressed in blackface, right? And that also included black people who blackened their already black skins. But it also meant when you have this great shifting of the world's population from Southern and Eastern Europe from the 1880s to the 1920s, and you had Jews and Polish people and other Southern, that one of the weird things in America's history is they often became white by blackening up, if that makes sense. Because it was a way of validating the fact that they were really white. That didn't mean other people didn't also do it, including African Americans. So we knew people did that on the stage. We know that the minstrel shows started when enslavement was still going on, right? I mean, you just look at the dates. Look at someone like Thomas Rice, the supposed original Jim Crow. He started when he was doing, 1828? Became famous around the early 1830s in the United States and abroad. And one thing that happens, when you get famous and start making money, you're going to get imitators. Doesn't that make sense? And so other people started, we get all of that. And enslavement's still going on when the minstrel shows are going on. So we see that. And we know that even after they became less popular, that even into the 1900s, that you had churches and other groups doing minstrel. We know all that minstrel stuff. But this is a thing we may not know. That sometimes people blackened their faces and committed crimes. Now, the best way for knowledge to work is that you suspend judgment, listen to someone, and then later determine if it was true. I'm not even going to ask you to do that. I'm going to ask you to assume I'm lying. That I'm one of these folks on television where the truth is now no longer the truth. Assume I'm one of them. And just go look it up. That newspaper, how many of you have access to that newspapers.com thing I was talking about? Anybody? All right, so raise your hand. Everybody's going to get her email. She's going to let you use her password so you don't have to pay the $140. See, this is why you can't video everything I say, Brad, all right? You'll get sued by newspapers.com. When you go home today, I want you to type in disguised as Negro, blackened face, raped, murder, whatever. Just start playing some games with the thing, right? And then set your year thing from, say, well, we don't even want to go back too far because we don't even want to believe that stuff can happen in present. Just start around 1900 and go from 1900 to 1930. And if you do what I did, you're going to find American newspapers, not small newspapers. The New York Times, the St. Louis Post, the Sacramento Bee, the San Francisco Chronicle, all these newspapers going to give story after story. I'm not saying it happened a zillion times. I'm saying, however, it was not rare. It was not rare. And those were the times it was discovered. So how many African Americans in this society were lynched because a person blackened their skin and committed a horrible crime? You think it happened at least once? Yeah, probably. So you're going to go do that research, right? Do we have any history majors in here? Oh, these are the history majors. Okay, good. So people like call me a historian. I'm not a historian. I'm a guy walking through the past paying attention. And I get this whole distinction between the past and history. I really get it, right? The past is what happened. History is what y'all say happened, right? And so I'm about walking through both of those things and I look at my own reports, and if you want to see fake news, go back and look at some of the ways race riots were reported based on what we read in what people read in those newspapers then versus what we now know to have occurred. That was fake news. Okay. How many of you knew the thing about people blackening their faces committing crimes? Are you going to raise your hand to you're killing me up here. Yeah, that's good.
Victorian America, in the century.
Okay. Well, in Ohio, I think it was Zanesville. It's in my book, the Watermelons book. I actually have the case, though, of someone like in 2015, an Ohio resident who was using a mask that was so lifelike that people thought he was an African American. He was robbing places. They eventually caught him. I'm not suggesting that happened a ton. I know it happened that one time. I think the other thing happened a lot. Matter of fact, that mask was so good that they showed his face on television, on the news. 2 African American women who were estranged from their children said, "That's my son." It's not your son. Okay. You mentioned something about pain. We have a section of the museum where black people are targets, where people throw things at them, where their pain is either summarily dismissed or laughed at. Is it possible that even today, that if some of you were doing medical sociology, that if you went into the hospitals and interviewed or surveyed people, you'd find that maybe we believe that black and brown people don't experience pain the same way white people do? Is that possible? Okay. Have you heard the whole thing about black people's heads being harder? You know, that slips into, anybody heard that before? Okay. Then the idea that groups experience pain difference, yeah, I think that still exists. What we don't have are people throwing at black people. We actually, you know the game where you throw and the person falls down into the water? That's a modern version of African Dodger, or hit the coon, or hit the nigger. And so we have original objects from times when actual black people would have their faces thrown at by people like Walter Johnson. So we have, here's another one. Go home tonight, type in Walter Johnson, Ty Cobb, and hit the coon, or hit the nigger. Type those in. And you will find newspaper accounts of them boasting of breaking the faces of black people. And then what happened after that, where real black people got replaced by plastic black people or wooden black people, whatever, symbolically. But you don't have to be a Freudian to figure out what's going on there. This is actually, I think, this is one of our, we produce little short videos too, and so we have one called Blacks as Targets. You can pick up some of the stuff I'm talking about. What's the new, it's not a museum, Brad, it's a more of a memorial down in Alabama that does all the lynchings. I was just talking to someone about it up there. They just opened down, is it in Montgomery? Yeah, from the Equal Justice Initiative, right? And they've discovered any number of lynchings that we did not know, that the Tuskegee folks did not find, the NAACP people didn't find, we couldn't find in public records and the like. Why do you think I have that trade card from 1882 next to that image? Yes.
The card kind of makes this threatening,
Yeah.
so it justifies.
Yes. So the point is that during enslavement, the dominant caricatures, by the way, a caricature is not a stereotype, right? The dominant caricature of African American men would have been Toms, right? Docile, weak, even though that's not the original Uncle Tom that Harriet Beecher Stowe did, but anyhow, would have been childlike, like the so-called Sambo, you know, a childlike buffoon, or if it was a child, would have been a pickaninny, you know, just these harsh, horrible, but weak, non-threatening caricatures. But go back and read the literature. Again, it helps to read the newspapers. There is this, right after enslavement, and especially into the period of Reconstruction, you start picking up words in the national discourse about Negro domination, the black brute, the Negro brute, the nigger brute, the colored brute, the mulatto brute. Type in brute in the last book, 2 chapters just on that. So what was the way you would deal with a brute? You killed him. Okay? All right, so let's do really quickly one of my little visual thinking things. First of all, what is that object? It's a license plate. Very good. So what is it saying? Come on, historians. That's very good. You're going to get everything right over here. I'm going to have to sit the two of you together and make you talk amongst yourselves. All right? So, yes, the one is supposed to be Lyndon Baines Johnson, right? Who's the other one? Yeah, see, the Martin Luther King. So if you go back to the 1960s, you had this sort of this national idea, this new talk about the new Democrat and the new Negro. Well, what this license plate is saying is that the new Negro and the new Democrat are still just what? Still just rats. And you know, we have created a hierarchy of animals. So a rat is not an eagle. Right? When we want to talk about, right, it's not a noble animal. What's significant about the fact that it's a license plate? That's right. See? Everybody. When I used to think of propaganda, I thought of grainy old film, right, with the little clicking sound, or faded yellow leaflets falling from the sky, right? I didn't think of a license plate. But any object can be propaganda. A child's game, a license plate, an ashtray. So that's pretty much the same image, isn't it? That's almost relevant to what I'm saying. It's like, you know, right on time with that, you know. Little black Sambo, little brave Sambo. Because I got into an argument with Christopher Bing. Anybody know Christopher Bing? He's a wonderful children's illustrator. And he came out with a new Little Black Sambo, I don't know, like 15 years ago or something, 10, 15 years ago. And so we were having a little argument or debate, and what he was trying to make me understand was that for him, Little Black Sambo was a story about a courageous little boy, a smart little boy, a little boy who outwitted the tigers. Are there tigers in India? A little boy who he wanted to be. And it reminded him of time he had spent with his grandfather. Now, I'm not trying to invalidate that. I'm sure that it had those meanings for him. But what I was trying to get him to understand is that for other people, it had a different meaning. So that an African American, especially one with dark skin, Sambo became a slur. Right? It became a kind of modern pickaninny. And I remember saying to him, he was like, yeah, but the book that I'm doing, I have taken out the caricatured images. And he's right. His images were beautiful. Go get a copy of Christopher Bing's book. Don't buy it. Find it in the library. I'm not even doing this with that. All right, just don't buy it. All right. Oh, you buy it if you want to buy it. I don't care what you buy. Anyway, it's beautiful. I mean, he is a wonderfully talented illustrator. And I said to him, you know what? You have the right to do that. And by the way, the right to do something is often the lowest bar, okay? You have the right to do that. But the human brain is not limited. Instead of trying to soap up this old racist story, just tell a new story. Just tell a new story. So, one of the mistakes I made in the museum was naming it the Jim Crow Museum. I should have just named it the museum or the Race Museum. Shouldn't even use the term racist, because not all the objects in the museum are racist. They just help us talk about race relations, and racism. And when I put Jim Crow on it, which I did because that was a good umbrella for the objects I had, because the objects I had were from the 1870s to the 1960s, and those objects supported the racial hierarchy in our society popularly known as Jim Crow. But when you name something Jim Crow, people assume that it's all about the past, and that none of those messages and none of those representations have morphed into the present. And the reality is they have. So when we talk about politics in the museum, and again, we talk about everything. And I usually don't talk until people are finished, because when I talk, it kills the conversation. Okay? That happens a lot of time when the professor talks. But when I do talk, one of the things I say about politics is this: I don't know a single politician, certainly not at the presidential level, that I don't have differences with. But that doesn't mean they're the Antichrist. That doesn't mean I have to racialize them. Doesn't mean I have to make them a monkey. Doesn't mean I have to lynch them. So this is like one of my favorite pieces. Because again, I'm not telling people what to believe, but there is a context. I don't want to tell you where to do racist shopping on the internet, but there's a website called Tightrope. Get it? And from them, you can get most of these t-shirts. One of the things I've noticed are that these extreme sites, the stuff they create often shows up in more mainstream sites like eBay or Cafe Press. So again, the idea of targets. I mean, just that over there, this right here. I know there's a point on here. If you go on the internet, that's actually called the running nigger target. And one of the political parties was recently in trouble because they had people at one of the conventions selling versions, paper versions of that target. We have two of those. And again, you don't have to be a psychologist to imagine a person in a safe space shooting that. And by the way, more fundamentally, imagine the caliber weapon that it takes to get through that. That thing's solid. So you're talking about high-powered weaponry in some safe space where people can use that as a target. And of course, that target there was made up of whom? Yes. So all across the campus we have now, how many of you heard of pimp and whore parties? Anybody? Raise your hands. So it's like, man, you can't admit to anything here. I mean, there's people here with the costume still on and they won't admit that they've heard of it. Has anybody been on a campus that had one of these kind of parties? Raise your hands. Raise them up. I mean, it doesn't mean you were there. Okay, good. Go and look across our nation at parties like that, so-called MLK parties, south of the border parties, black parties, all these different parties, right? They have a lot of things in common. And if you think about it, they're kind of an updated minstrel show, if you were, right? They're safe spaces. And so one of my questions to people, I'm not going to name the campus. I'm not even going to tell you what it rhymes with. But I was on a campus that had recently had one, and so I was talking to some of the students, and I was like, so when a person dresses up like a pimp or a so-called pimp or whore, what is their frame of reference? And their gait, G-A-I-T, the way they walk, where'd they get that from? That idea of that's the way a pimp walks. Where'd they get that from? And when they do a south of the border party or a welfare party or any of these parties, they're all over. Okay? What is the frame of reference? Well, you and I know what the frame of reference is. By the way, this, I have to say, is not at the University of Michigan. I will tell you this because I'm at the University of Michigan. That's at Clemson. So I don't know why that person had, a lot of times it's like you go to a football game and nobody there actually went to the school. You had that. We have it all the time. Here at Clemson, you have a person wearing those pants. Okay, and that image was all over the internet. And of course, that person is in blackface. So my point is they are acting, role modeling, right? What? I have to tell you this story in case you haven't read it. If you have read it, I apologize. When I was a little boy, we used to have a place where this is down in Pritchard, Alabama, where old black men would sit and just tell lies. And by lies, I mean that's what they refer to as these yarns, right? These epic stories. And you're a little boy, you don't know the difference between the truth and a lie. And so they told a story one time about a man named Cleotis Threadgill. And I tell this in the new book, but assuming you haven't read it out, please let me share it with you. So I'm probably 9 years old, and they're talking about this man named Cleotis Threadgill, good man, hardworking man, right? Religious, which is a big deal down there, solid, never gets in trouble. And Theotis is poor, doesn't have a lot of education. It's the late 1950s, doesn't have a lot of opportunities. And so one day, he's working in Mr. Sam Ryan's pecan orchard. And you got paid by the weight of your pecans. And he took his up there, and he had more than everyone else, so he expected more money. But instead of getting more money, he got the same $3 everybody else got. And he said the kind of thing that got a black man killed in Mobile in the 1950s. He said, I should get more money. Because in a sense, that's calling the white man a liar. Sam Ryan threw the money down on the ground, cussed him out, called him a bunch of racial stuff. Cleotis Threadgill stoops over, picks up the money, leaves. They don't have a physical altercation. He just leaves and goes home. He tells his friends about it. And his friends tell him to do what? Get the hell out of Mobile and do it now. He's got a raggedy house and a raggedy car. They convinced him to get in that jalopy out on Telegraph Road. See, it sounds real when I use specific names of streets, doesn't it? Gets on Telegraph Road, and he starts his car. And just as he's pulling away his car, Sam Ryan, now with 3 other whites in the car, these are not also wealthy, they are poor whites doing the bidding of a wealthy man, they chase off after him, and they mean to hurt him. They mean to do the kind of things to him that I write about in books. And he's scared. So he gets on Telegraph Road in that beat up piece of junk car, and he's driving away as fast as he can, and the car stops. He gets out of his car and he takes off running. And nobody runs as fast as they do when they're trying to still live. And he gets away. And they are so angry and so frustrated that they did not capture him that they lynch the car. I'm like, what the hell? I'm 9 years old. You understand what I'm saying? I'm 9 years old. To me, that's a real thing. Now, years later, I would come to understand that that was their way. First of all, I didn't know what an urban legend was, right? I didn't know what a memorable character was, right? I didn't know any of that stuff. All I know was they'll lynch my red ass too. This is what I'm thinking, right? I did not know until I started doing research that right where they sat, not a block from that, not a decade past, a black man had been lynched. And that when I look back over Pritchard, Alabama's history, within a 1 mile radius of there, several African American men. So maybe they knew about those. Maybe they did. Maybe this was their way of dealing with the reality that a lynching could occur. Does that make sense? So I kept that in my head for a long time. And then in 2012, I think it was 2012, Clint Eastwood at the Republican National Convention pulls out a chair, and he looks at that chair and pretends that President Obama is sitting in that chair. Anybody remember this? Okay. And he starts talking to the chair. And some people think it was clever. Some people think it was not that clever, whatever it was. But right after that, people started lynching chairs. I started thinking about this story they told me. And it didn't seem so silly then. You get my point? Okay. So I'm getting toward the end here. Just hang on. When I was really young, like many of us in school, I was forced to read Letter from Birmingham Jail. And I tell you something, when you get in your 30s and 40s and you reread stuff, it's like you didn't read it the first time. And now I really read it. Really, really read it. And this quote, which you hear everywhere, hit me. Because I had seen stuff that defiled women. I had seen objects that made fun of Christians. I had seen objects that made fun of atheists. I had seen objects that made fun of poor people. I had seen objects that made fun of a lot of groups, that mocked them, that dismissed them. I had seen that. But that's not what I was collecting. It wasn't, right? In 1990s, I sold a T-shirt with this image on it. I should have bought it. But here's the thing about ignorance and hatred in this country. You'll get another chance. And so years later, I saw this magazine. Now, there's a relevance. There's a parallel there. Look at our history. Read the newspaper articles I'm talking about. Read the literature I'm talking about. Go back, read the speeches and the like, and you'll see that an articulate, ambitious African American was often accused of trying to be what? Of trying to say it. White. And that a woman who was ambitious or whatever is accused of trying to be a what? Yeah, you see, you don't have to be deep to figure that out. There was a parallel. So I like to give absolutes because I'm a sociologist and we are by definition relativist. I mean, you can't convince a sociologist that killing folks is wrong because it's the context, right? If it's war, you give them a medal, right? But I'm going to give you an absolute. There's, 7.7 billion people on this earth. If you do, I have a math major over here somewhere. Where's my math major? There he is. If you do all the possible combinations of interactions between those 7.7 billion people, I mean, that's going to come up with, we don't even have a number for that, right? The possible interaction. And I'm going to tell you, in every one of those, here's an absolute that applies. In any interaction between any combination of humans, if it requires courage to speak, there's something wrong with the situation. No exceptions. Not a one. Now, does that mean that it sometimes does require? Of course it sometimes requires courage to speak. That just means there's something wrong with the situation. And she's being told what? Yeah, and when do you think this postcard was created? Right around the time of what? Women's what? That's right. That's right. So I began collecting objects on other groups. Halloween is a terrible time. We're not the city on the top of the hill during Halloween. And I don't want to sound like a prude, but that's about including when you have Halloween costumes for a 4-year-old and it's a French maid's costume, that's, okay, come on. I don't have no problem with you guys are old enough, wear your French maid costume. But I'm saying for a 4-year-old, that's actually a video game on the right, and that's a costume there. And again, when a person puts on one of these costumes, how do you, they change their voice, they change their walking, they act out their prejudices. mask over here is part of a costume that was sold by Walmart, $15.74, which makes it economically accessible to pretty much everyone in the U.S. And so one year I was at an honors conference, and we had only the honors students from all these different colleges in Michigan. We were in a cabin, no ESPN, no nothing, just us with each other. So we had all these long conversations. And I showed the costume, right? And that was the mask. And I said, is this offensive? Almost every student raised their hand. There's always one or two, right? This is the U.S. Gotta be, no, there's nothing wrong with that. It's funny. Well, a thing can be funny and offensive. Those are not mutually exclusive, right? But that's fine. That's fine. I said, is it racist? No. About a third of the people. I was like, well, what would it take to make it racist? Make it black. I actually was down at Virginia Theological Seminary, and I had a slide similar to this, and I said that poor white people are the one group that is categorically treated as trash. Poor white trash, as a label. Poor white trash, trailer trash, any other, there's some other descriptors we could have. And then somebody said to me, yeah, but what about in Europe where you have the Euro trash? I was like, okay, you're right. All right, I'm talking about the U.S. here. That's fine. So, but notice what we do with poor white people, similar to what we do sometimes with racial groups, where we create this false dichotomy. So on the one hand, you have this noble, the Waltons, right? This is, in a society that values Christianity over other religions, they are Christian, they are, they are patriotic in the way we believe patriotism should be. They're hardworking. They don't know when to stop saying goodnight. So you got that group. and then you have the other group. That's the way we do other racial minorities, or the way we do racial minorities. So this is actually an image that I created. I think we have like 3 slides left. This is actually an image that I created in the museum. It's a painting. And what it is just, it's simple. It's just saying that when we see so many caricatures, we stop seeing real people. And what we instead see are black people, or brown people, or red people, or gay people, or trans people, whatever people. We start seeing them as the caricature, that the lines get blurred. See it all the time in the discussions that we have. I do want to tell you this. You know Belford Lawson, right? Anybody know Belford Lawson? Who was the first African American to win a case before the United States Supreme Court? Who was it? Yeah, why would I put his thing up here and ask you the question? It's not a trick. So you're saying it wasn't Thurgood Marshall? No, Thurgood was sitting in the back row angry. No, seriously angry. They would end up rivals for years. Well, Belford Lawson, before he came here and sat on the bench because the football coach, Yost, would not play him, okay, before he came here, where was he? He was at Ferris. And where was he before he was at Ferris? He was at Hampton. And what we discovered in the last 2 or 3 years in my office, and we're now finishing a draft of this book, between 1910 and 1928, several dozen African Americans, and so far we only found men, came from Hampton, which is today a fine major university, but at the time was basically a technical school only producing people who could fit the jobs that black people could have in 1910. They came to Ferris, took college prep, left Ferris, then went to Michigan, Northwestern, and those schools, and they went out and changed the United States. I would make you the argument that JFK might not have been president of the United States had Belford Lawson not been born, not gone to Hampton, not gone to Ferris, not come here, not left here and became a lawyer. Because when JFK voted against, that was the 1959 Civil Rights Act, that angered every influential black person, 59, 57 Act, that angered every influential black person in this country, and it was Lawson and his wife who served as surrogates for JFK to gain entree into African American community. And I think you could make the argument that that was the swing. But he wasn't the only one. Percival Prattis, anybody heard of Percival Prattis? First African American to be admitted to the House of the press corps of Congress was one of those young men who came from Hampton to Ferris. He didn't come to Michigan. We have found, I mean, they did amazing things. And here's the point. We didn't even know that at Ferris. We have archivists, we have historians, they didn't know it. All the time in this country, people keep saying to me, why do we have black history? Why do we have women's history? Why do we have gay history? Why do we have all that? If you don't want those things, then just do it right. Booker T. Washington spoke at Ferris in 1902. When he died in 1915, there was a memorial service for him in Detroit. Woodbridge Ferris preached his funeral. Woodbridge Ferris's last presentation was at Hampton's Founders Day in 1928. He was a senator then. In 1903, Woodbridge Ferris assembled the Ferris student body and read to them from W.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folks. That was a radical thing to do in 1903. In 1915, one of the most racist movies to ever come out, The Birth of a Nation, came out. Woodbridge Ferris, nationally, 1915, he'd have still been governor, said what? It's a damnable movie. I wish I had my 3 hours back. And I will show you toward the end of his life where he made quotes that sound, I mean, this is going to sound like I'm working for advancement and marketing at Ferris, that sounds like he was Martin Luther King. And yet we didn't even know that at our own school. That's the difference between the past and history. Past is what actually happened. So I don't have a lot in common with H. Ross Perot. He's actually now, I think it's a trend where billionaires convince poor people that they have their best interests at heart. It's a thing now. But I like this quote. I don't like the gendered language, but I like the quote. And we have people who look at the Jim Crow Museum and they say, we don't like the way you do that. It's too confrontational, it's too much in your face, it's too direct. And what I say to them is, I appreciate that, but I would appreciate it more if your pant legs were wet. So we have good news at the museum now. If you think of the most iconic photographs from the civil rights period, many of them were taken by Bruce Davison. Just signed the paperwork 2 days ago. They will now be donated to the Jim Crow Museum, the originals of those. Isn't that good? You can clap if you want to, yeah. Yeah. Yep. And who would have thought Big Rapids, Michigan, right? You can do good work anywhere. You can change the world from any vantage, from any place, okay? We're getting some of the, and this is, I just pulled out 4 of those because I thought you might know those 4. We'll be receiving those in about 2 weeks, and we don't have any place to put them. Brad, we don't have any place to put them. We got to do something about it. We have to build. And I'm thinking of this little boy down in Mobile, Alabama, just breaking some piece because he didn't like it. Now we got to build a research center, a Jim Crow scholarly research center that doesn't just bring in few people here and there. And actually people do come from all over the country. But where it's known, where they come, where it's the hub of the study of that period. And so we've now just started, and you can kind of see, oh, not the building. This is now in my brain, because I'm smarter now about asking people for money. Did he come here to ask us for money? No, that's not what I'm doing. I'm going to give you all the reasons you won't give me money. So I'm hoping in the next 4 or 5 years that we build this facility, that I find the $8 billion to do it. And then this will be the last slide. My daughter played soccer for Christian Brothers. I don't know if you know Christian Brothers down in Memphis, but when she was a little girl, she played, you guys know score soccer? You don't know score soccer? You could have just, if you just said, yeah, they wouldn't have known. Okay. How many of you know travel soccer? Anybody know travel soccer? So a couple things you know. 1, it's expensive. 2, it's time consuming. 3, they don't know when to stop practice, right? And so one day we were at practice and there's these modern day, Brady Bunch vehicles. Instead of station wagons, they're all vans, right? They're all Dodge vans and just a whole row. So I'm sitting in one of them. Practice should have been over an hour ago. And I'm really getting I'm practicing my patience. And so I look outside, and inside the van is myself and my oldest daughter, who, by the way, is now at Penn. And she doesn't like when I say this, and I really shouldn't say it because we've been taped. The first Pilgrim to make it into an Ivy League school without a mop. And she hates when I say that. I think that's funny. That's my working class. Okay, fine, that didn't go over well. All right, I'll go back to my Michigan stories. Anyway, I think that's funny. Anyhow, cut that part out of the tape. Anyhow, long story short, she's in the back. She's probably, I don't know, Peggy could tell me how old she is, but she can't be very old. Maybe she's 13 or something at that point. And my other daughter, who's playing travel soccer, is probably 10, and so she's on the field. But there's 4 people who have this mask, and they are playing with it. Now, you can't judge people's gender, their sex, their ethnicity from afar, but they look like 2 boys and 2 girls who were white, whatever any of that means. The 2 people, 2 of them would put on the mask, the 2 boys would put on the mask, and then they would start like flashing gang signs, which, by the way, that's not even that smart. They were like doing what they imagine to be gangs. In other words, they start acting in the way acting out their prejudices. And then there was laughter, and a certain people, they were walking, and they were having fun. And they weren't any farther from me than I am from him, right? So if you're a parent, you know what I did. You know what I did. I turned around to look to see my other child. That's what I did. And she had her head in her hands, and her head covered by her hands, and her head in her lap. So this is why I do what I do. If my work makes that happen one less time, then I'm doing good work. One less time. I could get out there, I could yell, scream, and by the way, if you chase my life, you know I've also been the person yelling, screaming with signs, protests. I'm that guy too. But the real work is to stop it before some child has their head in their lap. And I'll tell you this, you think of the person you love the most on this earth. You don't love that person any more than I love that little girl. And you don't love that person any more than I have hope for this country. So thank you very much. I don't know if you want to take a couple questions, or if you I know some of them got extra credit and they feel like, I earned my extra credit tonight. I'm done with this guy.
Well, we do have a couple of microphones here, and time for a few questions. And while Amy and Brad are getting the microphones, I just want to remind all of you students who are going off to do
Thanks, Brad.
your research that the library has a subscription to many, many online newspapers, and you won't have to pay the $130. So just go to the university library.
It's actually 140, but that's right.
Go to their website, and you can do your research.
Raise your hand if you have questions, and we'll get the microphone to you. Yep, we're coming.
Thank you so much for that talk. That was illuminating and
Thank you.
difficult. And my question for you has to do with sort of the difficulty in not only teaching specifically about racism, especially contemporary racism, but also about the emotional responses people have to seeing these objects maybe that are unexpected or that are a little bit more difficult and that they might react to really strongly. So how do you train your docents and your museum workers to address that without maybe sort of jumping in and intervening too early, or sort of with giving them the space to feel their feelings, but also making sure that they feel relatively safe in the museum?
All right, so I think the most common response people have is kind of a reflective sadness. I think if that's where they stay, we probably failed a little bit. So in terms of the docents themselves, and I didn't talk about this, and I wish I had, we sometimes get criticized for having white docents, and that is another layer. And keep in mind, for us, everything's on the table, right? I mean, because you met me a little bit, so you can kind of see what that's going to be like. So what that means is, before you come in the museum, we talk about some of that stuff before you come in. And we explain to people, we're not an African American Studies museum. First of all, I think white, red, whatever should be able to work in there too. But especially in a facility like ours, we are a racism museum. We're a museum about relationships. So a lot of the work we do with docents is about relationships. The most practical thing that we do is we meet once a week and talk about, go over the problematic pieces. For my docents, and this is why I told you all of that, for my docents, the most common sort of challenging thing recently has been, I'm just being honest, so, an African American, older person coming in saying, I'm not having a discussion about race with a white docent. And my thing is well, then you have to have a discussion someplace else. Okay? Because it's like, I taught sociology. We had a chapter on poverty. Most of the people that taught that course weren't poor, right? I mean, I'm a sociologist. I taught courses in gender. I'm not a woman. So part of it is to make the things that are problematic a source of the discussion itself, but not to the point where it is uncomfortable for the docents. And so that's been a thing. And I'm actually trying to get our docents to write about those experiences, because I think they're very valuable. I think what we've done is, sometimes in order to try to please various groups, we give more weight to some groups than other groups at some times, whereas I'm wanting us to have the free exchange of ideas while at the same time respecting the fact that people have different experiences. And so the short answer would be that we have a weekly discussion, and it's a real discussion. It's with real examples. And out of that comes, so one of the things we've been doing lately is we have a little section out front. We've changed the script out front a little bit. In the old days, we used to have a lot more faculty docents. They were volunteer, but quite frankly, they wanted to be paid, and we didn't have the money to pay them versus hiring just full-time docents. And so we had to find other ways to compensate the faculty who might have, in some ways, some additional skills that the other docents might not have, that kind of thing. So not a great answer, but it's just, like I said, it's part of the dialoguing. I mean, I have people come in the museum and they'll say to me, I thought you were darker. And I was like, I did too. I mean, I listened to me and I thought, dude, that dude is black as hell. And then I saw him, So my point is I'm not offended at anything. We got to grow up as a nation. We got to be able to have real conversations. We end up in situations like we're in over the last 2 years because we stopped having real conversations. That's how we get where we got right now, because it got to a point where we couldn't have meaningful, challenging, pushback discussions among good people. Because we couldn't do that anymore, that's in large part why we got where we are.
Other questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I just have a question. So now when I think about sort of problematic pieces of art, Confederate monuments come up
Yeah.
quite a bit. Do you have any of those in the museum, or is there discussion about that?
Yeah, we've actually been offered 2 monuments. And what I say to people is, I would love to have these, but A, we don't have a space for them. B, there's no way the president and the board goes on, because we are a university place, so we're not going to just move it. But here's a more fundamental reason why we shouldn't accept those. Those need to be dealt with where they are. So I may disappoint you when I say this. I'm not for destroying pieces. What I am for is recontextualizing them. I don't want to get rid of all the evidence. I would be the biggest hypocrite in the world. I've been collecting the evidence my whole life, but I'm not for it being placed in front of the Social Security Administration. You get where I'm going? Or some public space. They need to be contextualized and dealt with there. They were placed there 30, 40, 50 years after the Civil War. Then they need to have the discussions now, and sometimes what that means is just moving them. I'm going to take this even further, and that's the part that makes some of my friends on the left crazy. I'm going to make my friends on the right crazy when I say this. I think there needs to be additional monuments, but not those. I think there needs to be recognition every place, because since we're never going to have a truth and reconciliation movement in a society, I think there ought to be places designating where folks were lynched. And I'm saying that many, many years ago. I know Naomi Tutu, Desmond Tutu, one of those name-dropping things, and they did that in South Africa. All right, we're never going to do that in the U.S. We do bits and pieces of that. But I am for those. So I don't want to give you the name of the city, but now I will say this: the University of Virginia, they worked really closely with us. I called them on the phone. Actually, some people from our institution called them on the phone, and I know the guy who's the vice president of diversity and inclusion at Marcus, and they basically said to us, "You give us 3 hours, we'll tell you what we did right and what we did wrong." That's collegiality. You understand what I mean? That was great. And they bore their stuff out with, they bared it to us, right? I think we can learn from each other. When Oklahoma had stuff going on, they called me on the phone. We need to do this stuff together, learn together. But back to your original question, no, there's no way we're going to get to have one of those monuments on campus. We have a monument on our campus that I love already, and it's a statue of Woodbridge Ferris. Yeah.
Right here. So thank you for this great talk. I actually wanted to ask you about something you write about in Understanding Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. There's a moment in there in which you mention in the 1960s and 1970s, people were destroying all of this memorabilia, and then it turns into this huge industry, and people are selling it online. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that transition between, we should get rid of this, to, we can make money off of this. What is that about?
Yeah, I think the easiest answer to what happened was that some people who still had a lot of it came out with price guides. And the price guides, it would be their own collection. Photographs of their own collection with the prices on it that they said on it. It created a market in the antique, the secondary market, right? So I think that was a piece of it. I also think this, and someone said they were in economics here, if you destroy a bunch of it, right, you make it scarcer. And so that actually created a market for reproductions. But I think it was mostly driven by antique dealers, some of which were antique people. So I think it was as simple as that. I really do. I don't think it was some bigger thing, because I watched the prices go up. And I'll give you something else. They've gone down. And part of that has been eBay and the other internet auction houses, because they were like what people would really pay. And so now the prices have gone down a little bit. But there's, again, I think it was truly a market thing. Yes, there's the race parts to it and all the other stuff, but I think it was primarily driven by money. The biggest collector, there's all kind of people that collect this stuff. The biggest category of collectors has always been speculators. Always, black or white. I was going to the National Black Memorabilia thing they have in Gaithersburg and D.C. area for years. I've watched dealers go from being white to black. It's still all about money. All about money, selling it. And here's the thing. I might go to hell for something else, but it won't be for selling racist objects. But I see people selling lynching postcards. All right? I mean, and just think about the dynamics involved in that, right? I got in an argument with Alan, the guy that did Without Sanctuary, because he was arguing that he owned this image of this lynching. And I just said to him, you may have some legal standing here, but I want you to hear what you're saying to me. That I'm trying to create I'm not just trying to take the higher ground. You push me up on the higher ground. What you're saying to me is that you own this image of this black man naked, all kind of mutilated, on a postcard, that you found a way to own it, and that I can't use it in a museum that's teaching about the situations that result in lynchings. And he says, yeah, that's right. I say, well, good, then go get a lawyer, because it's in the museum. Then get a lawyer. So, yeah, I mean, the fact that this stuff has a monetary value that's a whole nother piece of this, you know. And quite frankly, the worse it is, it correlated with the more valuable the more expensive the piece is. But there's also, people collect for all reasons. I met a guy one time who collected tiles, like floor tiles. He had to have every one. So he had to have the racist ones too. And in his mind, it had nothing to do with that, with race. It's like, I don't have that one, right? And then, of course, you have the white supremacy groups and the ideological groups, who have to have stuff. And then, of course, this is still the U.S. And the maverick who says, you don't tell me what to do. I can have whatever I want in my home. I can have whatever. Shut up. It's mine. This is liberty, right? So you have all kind of groups. Listen, this has been very good. How many of you are now resolved that you are going to come to the metropolis of Big Rapids to visit the Jim Crow Museum? Let me see your hands. Good. How many of you have already been there? Well, of course, you worked at Ferris, but so good. So I did not mention that we're also in the early stages of creating a sexism museum. And the reason for that is this, once again, just like with the racism piece, America doesn't have enough, but already has African-American museums, African-American studies museums, African-American history museums, but didn't have a racism museum. America has women's studies museum, women achievement museum, whatever, but doesn't have a sexism museum, okay? And whether it's a part of my muckraking, part of me as a sociologist, I don't know, but I believe that that's a part of the discussion. And I also know this, the other museums won't deal with this stuff. Some of them shouldn't deal with it, but they won't deal with it. And we lose a wonderful opportunity to educate people, because museums can do that. Can't they do that, Brad? They can do that. Thank you very much. Thank you.